Japanese pilots couldn't escape P-38 Lightning over Solomon's documentary, narration script 7,000 plus words. In the steaming jungles and azure waters of the Solomon Islands, a revolutionary aircraft changed the course of the Pacific War. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, with its distinctive twin-boom design and forked tail, became the aircraft that Japanese pilots learned to fear above all others. With its unique silhouette, devastating firepower, and exceptional range, the Lightning transformed American fighter tactics and helped turn the tide of World War II in the Pacific. This is the story of how American ingenuity, tactical evolution, and the courage of young pilots in twin-engined fighters hunted the Japanese Air Force over some of the most hostile territory on Earth. August 7th, 1942. As dawn broke over the tropical waters of the Solomon Islands, the largest amphibious operation yet undertaken by American forces in the Pacific War began. 16,000 United States Marines stormed the beaches of Guadalcanal and nearby Tulagi in Operation Watchtower, the first major Allied offensive against the Empire of Japan. Their objective was deceptively simple, but strategically critical: capture the nearly completed Japanese airfield at Lunga Point on Guadalcanal and deny Japan the ability to threaten the vital supply lines between the United States and Australia. If Japan could complete and operate this airfield, American convoys carrying troops and supplies to Australia would be within easy range of Japanese bombers. The lifeline to the Southwest Pacific would be severed. The Marines encountered surprisingly light resistance during the initial landings. The Japanese construction crews, startled by the naval bombardment and the sight of the invasion fleet, fled into the jungle. By nightfall on August 8th, 11,000 Allied troops under the command of Lieutenant General Alexander Vandergrift had secured not only Tulagi and several small nearby islands, but also the precious airfield at Lunga Point. The construction work was nearly complete. The Japanese had been given extra sake rations the night before the invasion to celebrate finishing ahead of schedule. Now, this strategic asset belonged to the United States. The Marines immediately set about completing the runway and fortifying their positions. They renamed the airfield Henderson Field in honour of Major Lofton Henderson, commanding officer of Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241, who had been killed just 2 months earlier at the Battle of Midway while leading his squadron against Japanese carrier forces. Henderson was the first Marine aviator to die in that pivotal battle, and now his name would be forever associated with one of the most contested pieces of real estate in the Pacific War. But holding Henderson Field would prove infinitely more challenging than taking it. The Japanese reacted to the invasion with fury and determination. Tokyo could not allow this strategic position to remain in American hands. Throughout the fall and winter of 1942, the Empire of Japan threw everything at Guadalcanal. Reinforcements delivered by destroyers in daring nighttime runs. The Marines grimly dubbed the Tokyo Express, devastating naval bombardments that sent battleship shells crashing into Henderson Field and turned the surrounding waters into what sailors called Iron Bottom Sound due to the dozens of ships sent to the bottom, and relentless aerial attacks launched from the massive Japanese base at Rabaul in New Britain, over 500 miles to the northwest. The first aircraft to land at Henderson Field was a PBY Catalina patrol bomber on August 12th. 8 days later, on August 20th, 31 Marine aircraft, 19 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters, and 12 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers were launched from the escort carrier USS Long Island and flew to Guadalcanal, forming the field's first permanent air contingent. 2 days later, a squadron of US Army Bell P-39 Airacobra fighters arrived. These aircraft and their pilots would form the nucleus of what became known as the Cactus Air Force, named after the Allied code word for Guadalcanal. The Marines defending Henderson Field found themselves in an increasingly desperate situation. The fighters available to them, primarily P-39 Airacobras, P-40 Warhawks, and F-4F Wildcats, were outclassed by Japanese aircraft in critical categories. The Mitsubishi A6M-0, the Japanese Navy's premier carrier fighter, was a revelation that had shocked Western observers since its appearance over China in 1940. The Zero was unlike anything the Allies had encountered. Designed by Jiro Horikoshi and his team at Mitsubishi, in response to extraordinarily demanding requirements issued by the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1937, the Zero needed to be an effective interceptor, possess the maneuverability to engage enemy fighters, and have the range to escort Japanese bombers on long missions over China. Horikoshi's team achieved these seemingly contradictory goals through ruthless weight reduction and brilliant engineering. The A6M2 Model 210 that American pilots faced in 1942 weighed just 5,555 pounds fully loaded, nearly 2,000 pounds less than a Grumman F4F4 Wildcat. This lightweight gave the Zero phenomenal advantages. At low speeds, below 300 miles per hour, the Zero could outturn any American fighter. Its large ailerons provided exceptional roll rate at moderate speeds, allowing it to change direction with startling quickness. The Zero's climb rate was superior to early American fighters, and its service ceiling of over 38,000 feet meant it could operate at altitudes where Allied aircraft struggled. But the Zero's lightweight construction came at a terrible price. To achieve such low weight, Horikoshi's design team had eliminated armour protection for the pilot and omitted self-sealing fuel tanks. The aircraft was constructed of lightweight aluminum alloy with minimal structural redundancy. This made the Zero extraordinarily fragile. A few well-placed hits from heavy machine guns could set it ablaze or cause catastrophic structural failure. As one American pilot later observed, the Zero was easily destroyed once you had it in your sights. The trick was getting it into your sights. The Zeros operating from Rabaul and from Japanese carriers were flown by some of the most highly trained pilots in the world. Japan had begun the war with approximately 400 Zeros and a cadre of naval aviators who had honed their skills in combat over China. These men were aggressive, skilled, and confident in their aircraft's superiority. When they encountered American fighters over Guadalcanal in August and September of 1942, they fully expected to dominate. And dominate they did, at least initially. American pilots who tried to dogfight with Zeros found themselves in trouble. The Japanese fighters' superior maneuverability at low speeds meant that any pilot who slowed down and attempted a turning fight was asking to be shot down. The Zero could execute tight turns, loops, and rolls that American fighters simply couldn't match at combat speeds below 200 miles per hour. The situation grew increasingly desperate as autumn progressed. The Japanese made 3 major attempts to recapture Henderson Field through ground assault. The first came on August 21st in the Battle of the Tanaru, where a 900-man Japanese force was virtually annihilated. The second occurred from September 12th to 14th in the Battle of Edson's Ridge, where 6,000 Japanese soldiers under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi attacked the southern perimeter of Henderson Field and were decisively defeated. The third and most serious attempt came in late October during the Battle for Henderson Field, also known as the Battle of Guadalcanal. Over 3 days, from October 23rd to 26th, approximately 20,000 Japanese troops conducted numerous assaults at various points around the American defensive perimeter. The attackers included elements of the elite 2nd Sendai Division and 17th Army. The fighting was savage and desperate. On the night of October 24th to 25th, a single Marine battalion, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, was all that stood between Henderson Field and 2 Japanese regiments. Puller's Marines, reinforced by soldiers of the 164th Infantry Regiment, the first US Army unit to land on Guadalcanal, repelled wave after wave of Japanese attacks, inflicting over 3,500 casualties on the attackers. During these critical days, the Japanese Navy attempted to support the ground offensive by bombarding Henderson Field from the sea. On the nights of October 13th and 14th, Japanese cruisers and battleships, including the mighty battleships Kongo and Haruna, fired hundreds of 14-inch shells into Henderson Field, turning the night into a hellscape of explosions and fire. Dozens of aircraft were destroyed, fuel dumps went up in flames, and the airfield was cratered and damaged. But American engineers and ground crews worked through the night to repair the damage, and by dawn aircraft were taking off again to defend the perimeter. The naval battle of Guadalcanal in mid-November 1942 marked the turning point. In a series of desperate surface actions fought at point-blank range in the darkness, the US Navy intercepted and defeated Japanese attempts to bombard Henderson Field and land reinforcements. 2 Japanese battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, were sunk, along with numerous cruisers and destroyers. A convoy carrying 7,000 Japanese troops and their heavy equipment was virtually annihilated. Japan's last realistic hope of recapturing Guadalcanal died in those dark waters. But even as the ground situation stabilized, American pilots faced a critical problem in the air. They needed an aircraft that could match or exceed the Zero's performance. They needed an aircraft with the range to intercept Japanese bombers coming from Rabaul, over 500 miles away. They needed an aircraft with the firepower to destroy lightly built Japanese aircraft quickly and decisively. They needed the P-38 Lightning. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was born from an ambitious 1937 US Army Air Corps specification calling for a high-altitude interceptor. The requirements seemed impossible. The aircraft needed to reach 360 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, and reach that altitude in 6 minutes. It needed to carry armament and have endurance for at least 1 hour at full throttle. Lockheed's team, led by Hall Hibbard and Clarence Kelly Johnson, who would later design the SR-71 Blackbird, produced a revolutionary design. Unable to achieve the required performance with a single engine, they opted for twin Allison V-1710 liquid-cooled engines mounted on distinctive booms extending back from the wings. The central nacelle housed the pilot and, crucially, all of the aircraft's armament, 4 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns and 1 Hispano 20mm automatic cannon, all concentrated in the nose. This centralized armament configuration was a revelation. Unlike conventional fighters with wing-mounted guns that required convergent settings, the guns had to be aimed slightly inward so their fire would converge at a specific distance. Every bullet and shell from a P-38 flew straight down the pilot's line of sight. There was no convergence to worry about, no need to calculate deflection angles for wing-mounted weapons. Point the nose at the target, press the trigger, and a stream of 4 50 caliber rounds and explosive 20mm shells flew exactly where the pilot was looking. At ranges where other fighters were still aligning their fire patterns, the Lightning could deliver all its firepower to a single devastating point. The prototype XP-38 first flew on January 27, 1939, at March Field in California. On its transcontinental speed dash, it flew from California to New York in 7 hours and 2 minutes, a new record that captured headlines across America. The aircraft crashed on final approach to Mitchell Field due to carburetor icing, but the Air Corps had seen enough to order 13 service test aircraft. By 1942, the P-38 was entering large-scale production. Early versions had some problems. The engines were temperamental, particularly in cold weather, and pilots reported that the aircraft became difficult to control in high-speed dives due to compressibility effects as it approached the speed of sound. But these issues were being addressed, and the P-38's fundamental attributes, speed, range, firepower, and twin-engine reliability, made it ideal for the vast distances of the Pacific Theatre. The first P-38s arrived in the South Pacific in November 1942. Aircraft of the 339th Fighter Squadron, part of the 347th Fighter Group, flew into Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The Lightning's appearance was striking enough that German pilots in North Africa had already nicknamed it Der Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devil, due to its distinctive twin-boom configuration. Japanese pilots would soon develop their own fearful respect for this unusual fighter. But the P-38's arrival did not immediately guarantee success. In fact, the Lightning's first encounters with Japanese fighters revealed a critical and potentially fatal problem. American pilots didn't yet understand how to use their new weapon effectively. They were trying to fight the P-38 as if it were a Zero, attempting tight-turning dogfights where the nimble Japanese fighter held every advantage. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest fighter aces with 64 confirmed victories, observed these early P-38 operations with professional interest and growing satisfaction. Years after the war, Sakai wrote about what he witnessed. The strange-looking P-38 with its twin engines and twin booms made its combat debut in the Solomon Islands during the fall of 1942. The aircraft appeared to lack any distinctive features other than speed at great altitudes and very high diving speed. To the great delight of Japanese pilots, the Americans flying the P-38 would attempt to dogfight with the Zeros. This was exactly what Zero pilots wanted, close-in turning combat at low to medium speeds where the lightweight Japanese fighters' maneuverability was supreme. Japanese pilots shot down many P-38s in these early engagements. The P-38, for all its strength, simply could not outturn a Zero at low speeds and low altitudes. The Lightning was a much larger, heavier aircraft. The P-38F model that first arrived in the Pacific weighed over 15,000 pounds fully loaded. nearly 3 times the weight of a Zero. This mass gave the P-38 momentum and energy in high-speed maneuvers, but it was a severe handicap in low-speed turning fights. At speeds below 200 miles per hour, attempting to turn with a Zero was suicide. American pilots who forgot this lesson often paid with their lives. But a new generation of fighter pilots was learning fast, and they were developing tactics that would exploit the P-38's true strengths while avoiding its weaknesses. The key was understanding energy. Modern fighter combat is all about energy management, the combination of speed and altitude that gives an aircraft the ability to maneuver and attack. The P-38 Lightning possessed 2 critical advantages over Japanese fighters: superior speed at all altitudes and an impressive rate of climb. American pilots began to develop what became known as boom and zoom tactics. Instead of engaging in traditional dogfights, P-38 pilots would patrol at high altitude, typically 20,000 feet or higher, where the Zero's performance degraded significantly. The Zero's lightweight construction and low wing loading made it supremely maneuverable at moderate altitudes, but at 20,000 feet and above, the thin air reduced its performance. The Zero's engine, a 14-cylinder Nakajima Sakai radial, producing 950 horsepower, lacked the power needed to maintain good performance at extreme altitudes. The P-38, by contrast, with its twin turbocharged Allison engines producing a combined 2,470 horsepower, could cruise efficiently at high altitude for hours. When P-38 pilots spotted Japanese aircraft below them, bombers heading for Henderson Field, or Zeros flying combat air patrol, they would dive down at high speed, often exceeding 400 miles per hour. At these speeds, the P-38's weight became an asset, giving it tremendous momentum. The P-38 pilot would make a single firing pass, all 4 machine guns and the cannon blazing, concentrating their fire on a single target. The devastating firepower of 5 weapons firing simultaneously could tear a Zero apart in seconds. Then, instead of slowing down to turn with the enemy, the P-38 pilot would use his speed to climb back to altitude, trading velocity for height. The Zero pilots below would watch helplessly as the Lightning zoomed away, unable to follow because their aircraft lacked the engine power and the speed. Once back at altitude, the P-38 pilot could set up for another attack, repeating the process. Each attack run lasted only a few seconds, but those few seconds of concentrated firepower were often enough to destroy a Japanese aircraft. And if the first pass didn't result in a kill, the P-38 pilots simply climbed away to safety and tried again. The Japanese pilots below faced a nearly impossible situation. They couldn't climb fast enough to reach the P-38s before the American fighters dove away, and they couldn't escape by diving because the P-38 was faster in a dive. Saburo Sakai, the same Japanese ace who had initially been pleased by American tactics, later admitted the changed situation with remarkable honesty. He wrote that it was obvious the Americans had not at first learned the most favourable characteristics of the big heavy P-38, and that the airplane was at first more misused in combat than properly flown. Before long, however, the painful lesson of burning P-38s changed the situation. Once American pilots became aware of the Zero's poor high-altitude performance, and its inability to dive at great speed, Sakai admitted, they were faced with an enemy of terrifying effectiveness. It was no longer possible for Zero fighters to successfully engage the P-38s except under the most unusual conditions. This was an extraordinary concession from one of Japan's premier fighter pilots. The tactical tables had completely turned. Now it was Japanese pilots who faced obsolete tactics and increasingly worn-out aircraft, while American pilots flew newer models of the P-38 with improved engines, dive flaps to control speed in steep descents, and powered ailerons that improved roll rate and handling. The P-38's twin engines also provided psychological and practical advantages that were especially important over the vast Pacific. In a single-engine fighter, engine failure over water hundreds of miles from land meant almost certain death. Pilots would bail out into shark-infested waters with little hope of rescue, but the P-38's twin engines provided redundancy. If one engine was damaged by enemy fire or suffered mechanical failure, the pilot could shut it down and fly home on the remaining engine. The Lightning could maintain altitude and even climb slowly on one engine, giving pilots a fighting chance to reach friendly territory. This reliability gave P-38 pilots confidence to fly long-range missions deep into enemy territory, knowing they had a backup if something went wrong. Many P-38 pilots returned to base with one engine shut down after combat damage, grateful for the twin-engine configuration. The aircraft's range was also exceptional. With drop tanks, a P-38 could fly over 1,500 miles, allowing it to escort bombers to distant targets or conduct fighter sweeps deep into Japanese-held territory. On April 18, 1943, the P-38 Lightning participated in what would become the most famous and consequential fighter mission of World War II. American codebreakers working in the basement of the old administration building at Pearl Harbor had intercepted and decrypted Japanese naval communications, revealing that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet and architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, would be flying to Bougainville Island on an inspection tour. Yamamoto's itinerary was precise. He would depart Rabaul at 6 a.m. on April 18th aboard a Mitsubishi G4M Type 1 bomber, the aircraft the Allies called Betty, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. He would arrive at the Japanese airfield at Kahili on Bougainville at 9:35 a.m. local time. The intelligence was gold. Here was an opportunity to kill the man who had planned Pearl Harbor, the brilliant strategist who had led Japan's navy through its greatest victories. But the mission presented extraordinary challenges. The target was more than 430 miles from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, requiring a round trip of over 860 miles. To avoid alerting the Japanese that their codes had been broken, the intercepting aircraft would need to approach from an unexpected direction, making the intercept appear to be a chance encounter rather than a carefully planned assassination. They would need to fly at very low altitude to avoid Japanese radar installations on Bougainville and nearby islands, and they would need to arrive at exactly the right moment. Too early, and the Japanese would be alerted. Too late, and Yamamoto would be on the ground, protected by anti-aircraft guns and fighters. Only one aircraft in the Pacific Theater had the range to accomplish this mission, the P-38 Lightning. 18 Lightnings from the 339th Fighter Squadron, part of the 347th Fighter Group, were selected for Operation Vengeance. The aircraft were fitted with 310-gallon drop tanks under each wing, giving them the range needed for the long overwater flight. Major John Mitchell, the squadron's operations officer, would lead the mission. Mitchell was a skilled pilot and a meticulous planner. He plotted a complex 5-leg approach route that would take the P-38s west from Guadalcanal, then northwest over the ocean, before turning northeast to approach Bougainville from the southwest, the direction the Japanese would least expect American fighters to appear from. The entire 430-mile outbound leg would be flown at wavetop height, just 50 feet above the ocean, to stay below Japanese radar coverage. The P-38s took off from Henderson Field and Fighter 2 on Guadalcanal at 7:10 a.m. on April 18th. 2 aircraft turned back early with mechanical problems, leaving 16 to continue the mission. Major Mitchell led the formation, maintaining strict radio silence and precise navigation. The pilots flew so low that spray from the waves occasionally struck their windscreens. The flight was tense. One navigational error and they would miss the intercept entirely, or worse, arrive at the wrong location and alert the Japanese to their presence. After flying for nearly 2 hours, Mitchell's formation reached the coast of Bougainville and turned northeast, beginning their climb to attack altitude. Mitchell split his force into 2 elements. 4 P-38s led by Captain Thomas Lanphier Jr. and Lieutenant Rex Barber would be the attack element, tasked with shooting down Yamamoto's bomber. The remaining 12 P-38s under Captain Besby Holmes would fly top cover, protecting the attack element from the Zero escorts. At precisely 9:33 a.m., just 2 minutes ahead of the predicted intercept time, Mitchell's pilots spotted 2 Betty bombers approaching Bougainville from the northwest, exactly as intelligence had predicted, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. The timing was perfect. Mitchell called out the sighting and the P-38s jettisoned their drop tanks, accelerating to attack speed. What happened next has been the subject of debate and controversy for decades. Captain Lanphier and Lieutenant Barber both claimed credit for shooting down Yamamoto's bomber, and the historical record has been clouded by incomplete documentation and conflicting accounts. Modern historical research, including analysis of Japanese records and examination of the crash site, has established that Lieutenant Rex Barber fired the shots that brought down Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft. As the P-38s attacked, the Zero escorts reacted, turning to engage the American fighters. Lanphier engaged the Zeros, shooting down one. Barber pressed his attack on the bombers. The first Betty, carrying Yamamoto, attempted to escape by diving toward the jungle canopy. Barber pursued, firing repeated bursts from his 4 machine guns and cannon. His fire struck the bomber's right engine and right wing. The Betty attempted a crash landing in the jungle, but struck the trees at high speed and exploded. All aboard, including Admiral Yamamoto, were killed instantly. Yamamoto's body was found the next day by Japanese search parties, still strapped in his seat. He had been killed either by the crash or by 50 caliber rounds that struck him during the attack. The second Betty, carrying Yamamoto's chief of staff, Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, also attempted to escape. It was attacked by other P-38s and crash-landed in the ocean near the coast. Ugaki survived with serious injuries. 3 of the 6 Zero escorts were shot down. All the P-38s except 1 returned safely to Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Raymond Hine was shot down by Zeros and killed during the engagement. The death of Admiral Yamamoto dealt a severe psychological blow to Japanese morale. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor, who had led the combined fleet through its greatest victories, was dead, killed by the Americans. The mission demonstrated not just the P-38's exceptional range and combat effectiveness, but the growing competence and confidence of American forces in the Pacific. The United States had reached across 400 miles of enemy-controlled ocean to strike down Japan's most capable naval commander. The message was clear: nowhere was safe. In May 1943, recognizing the dire need for more long-range fighters in the Pacific, the 5th Air Force activated a new fighter group entirely equipped with P-38 Lightnings, the 475th Fighter Group. This unit would become known as Satan's Angels, named for the cartoon devil painted on their aircraft. The group would become the most successful P-38 unit of the war and would produce some of America's greatest fighter aces. The 475th Fighter Group consisted of 3 squadrons: the 431st, 432nd, and 433rd Fighter Squadrons. They deployed to the Southwest Pacific area under the command of 5th Air Force, based initially in Australia, before moving forward to New Guinea and eventually the Philippines as the Allied advance progressed. The group's mission was clear: establish air superiority over Japanese-held territory, escort bombers to their targets, and destroy Japanese aircraft wherever they could be found. 2 names stand above all others in the history of the 475th Fighter Group and in American fighter aviation as a whole: Major Richard Ira Bong and Major Thomas Buchanan McGuire, Jr. Both flew P-38 Lightnings with the 475th Fighter Group. Both would achieve legendary status. Both would die young. Richard Bong was an unlikely fighter ace. Born in 1920 in Poplar, Wisconsin, a farming community of barely 300 people, Bong was quiet, modest, and unassuming. He stood 5 feet 8 inches tall, had a slight build, and seemed almost invisible in a crowd. But in the cockpit of his P-38 Lightning, this soft-spoken farm boy transformed into an aggressive, intuitive hunter with exceptional flying skills and deadly marksmanship. Bong's path to becoming America's ace of aces, the highest-scoring fighter pilot in US history, was not without difficulty. He struggled initially with aerial gunnery, and his early training reports were mixed, but he possessed an innate understanding of 3-dimensional combat maneuvering and a calm temperament under fire that served him well. Bong arrived in the Southwest Pacific in September 1942 and scored his first aerial victory in December of that year, shooting down a Japanese fighter over Buna, New Guinea. Bong's combat tactics exemplified the evolved P-38 doctrine that had emerged from hard-won experience. He avoided drawn-out dogfights, instead using the Lightning's speed and climbing power to position himself for devastating boom and zoom attacks. But Bong added his own refinement. He would close to point-blank range before opening fire, sometimes within 50 feet of his target, ensuring that his concentrated firepower, 450 caliber machine guns, and one 20mm cannon all firing simultaneously, would utterly destroy the lightly built Japanese aircraft. This aggressive close-range shooting style was risky. Several times Bong's own P-38 was damaged by debris from aircraft he had just destroyed. So close was he when they exploded. But the tactic was devastatingly effective. Bong's marksmanship, combined with his patience in setting up the perfect shot, made him extraordinarily successful. Between December 1942 and December 1944, Richard Bong was credited with 40 aerial victories, all flying the P-38 Lightning. He became America's ace of aces, surpassing Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26 victories. General George Kenney, commander of 5th Air Force, recognized Bong's value not just as a fighter pilot, but as a symbol of American air power and a morale builder. After Bong achieved his 40th victory in December 1944, Kenney ordered him home, concerned that continued combat would inevitably result in Bong being killed. Bong was awarded the Medal of Honor by General Douglas MacArthur in December 1944 for his extraordinary achievements. Tragically, Richard Bong survived 2 years of combat over the Pacific, only to die in a test flight accident. On August 6, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Bong was killed when the engine of a Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star jet fighter he was testing failed on takeoff near Burbank, California. He was just 24 years old. He left behind his wife Marjorie, whom he had married just 6 months earlier. Major Thomas McGuire was Bong's closest competitor and his polar opposite in personality. Where Bong was quiet and unassuming, McGuire was intense, driven, and openly ambitious. Born in 1920 in Ridgewood, New Jersey, McGuire moved with his family to Florida and later to Alaska as a child. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps in 1941 and earned his wings in February 1942. McGuire arrived in the Southwest Pacific in March 1943 and was assigned to the 431st Fighter Squadron of the 475th Fighter Group. He flew a P-38 Lightning he named Pudgy, after his wife Marilyn's college nickname. The nose of his aircraft was decorated with a painting of Marilyn. McGuire's skill at handling the large twin-engine fighter was legendary among his fellow pilots. He understood the P-38's strengths and limitations better than almost anyone, and became an instructor and tactical innovator. McGuire authored a manual on combat tactics for the entire 5th Air Force, documenting the boom and zoom techniques that had proven so effective against Japanese fighters. His manual emphasized several key principles. Always maintain an altitude and speed advantage. Never slow down and try to turn with a zero. Always jettison external fuel tanks before entering combat, and never engage at low altitude where there was no room to dive away if something went wrong. McGuire scored his first aerial victory in August 1943 and steadily increased his score through 1944. By December 1944, with Bong having been sent home, McGuire was the leading active American ace in theatre. On Christmas Day, December 25, 1944, McGuire shot down 4 Japanese fighters in a single mission over Luzon in the Philippines. The next day, December 26th, he shot down 3 more, bringing his total to 38 victories, just 2 behind Bong's record of 40. But on January 7, 1945, while leading an unauthorized fighter sweep over Negros Island in the Philippines, McGuire made a series of fatal decisions that violated his own tactical doctrine. His flight of 4 P-38s encountered a lone Japanese Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighter at low altitude. Despite still carrying external drop tanks, which added weight and drag and were supposed to be jettisoned before combat, McGuire attacked the Oscar to protect his wingman. The Oscar pilot, skilled and determined, turned hard to evade. McGuire, instead of breaking off the attack as his own manual prescribed, attempted to follow in a tight turn at low altitude. His P-38, heavy with the drop tanks and at low speed, stalled at just 300 feet. There was no altitude to recover. The Lightning rolled inverted and crashed into the jungle, killing McGuire instantly. He was 24 years old. Thomas McGuire was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his heroism and extraordinary achievements. He remains the second-ranking American ace of all time, behind only his friend and rival Richard Bong. Both men achieved every one of their victories flying the P-38 Lightning. Their success and their tragic deaths symbolize both the effectiveness of the Lightning in Pacific combat and the terrible price paid by those who flew it. The 475th Fighter Group produced not just Bong and McGuire, but an entire generation of skilled Lightning pilots. By the war's end, 38 additional pilots from the 475th had achieved ace status, 5 or more aerial victories. The group's commander for 20 months, Colonel Charles MacDonald, scored 27 victories flying his famous P-38 nicknamed Put Put Maru, making him the 7th-ranking American ace of World War II. Major Gerald Johnson scored 22 victories, and Major Robert de Haven scored 14. These men, and hundreds of others who flew with Satan's Angels, established the P-38 Lightning as the dominant fighter in the Southwest Pacific. The numbers tell the story of the P-38's dominance. The Lightning was credited with destroying more Japanese aircraft than any other US Army Air Force's fighter type. 7 of the top 8 scoring USAF aces in the Pacific flew the P-38 Lightning. The 475th Fighter Group alone was credited with 551 Japanese aircraft destroyed, while losing only 56 P-38s to enemy action, a kill ratio of nearly 10-1. The P-38 was the only American fighter in large-scale production throughout the entire American involvement in World War II, from December 1941 through August 1945. From the Japanese perspective, the evolution of P-38 tactics represented a nightmare scenario. By late 1943 and through 1944, Japanese pilots found themselves in an impossible tactical situation. American P-38s would patrol at altitudes where the Zero's performance degraded significantly. The Japanese fighters simply didn't have the engine power to climb quickly enough to reach the P-38s before the American fighters executed their diving attacks. When P-38s attacked, they came down at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. Japanese pilots had only seconds to react before the P-38's devastating firepower was upon them. And when Japanese pilots attempted to dive away to escape, they found that the P-38 was faster in a dive. The Zero's lightweight construction and fabric-covered control surfaces meant that at high speeds the aircraft became difficult to control and sometimes suffered structural failure. Several Japanese pilots were killed when their aircraft broke apart during desperate high-speed dives, attempting to escape P-38s. If Japanese pilots tried to climb away, the P-38's superior power-to-weight ratio at high speeds meant the American fighters could follow them. If they tried to turn and fight, P-38 pilots simply refused to engage, using their speed to disengage and set up another attack. Saburo Sakai wrote that once American pilots learned proper tactics, it became nearly impossible for Zeros to engage P-38s successfully, except under the most unusual circumstances. This was an extraordinary admission from a pilot who had dominated the skies over China and the Pacific in 1942. The tactical situation had completely reversed. The concentrated firepower of the P-38 was particularly devastating against Japanese aircraft. Jiro Horikoshi, the brilliant designer of the Zero, had sacrificed protection for performance. Japanese fighters and bombers lacked armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks. When hit by the P-38's 450 caliber machine guns and 20mm cannon, all firing directly down the pilot's line of sight, Japanese aircraft often exploded or caught fire immediately. American pilots reported that Zeros and other Japanese aircraft could be destroyed with a single, well-aimed burst of just 2 or 3 seconds. By contrast, the P-38 itself, while not as heavily armoured as aircraft like the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, was far more survivable than Japanese fighters. The twin engines provided redundancy. The pilot sat in an armoured seat with armour plate behind him. The fuel tanks, while not self-sealing in early models, were located in the wings away from the pilot. P-38s regularly returned to base with significant battle damage, one engine shut down, chunks of wing or tail missing, hydraulics damaged, but they brought their pilots home alive. The P-38J and P-38L models, introduced in 1944, incorporated lessons learned from 2 years of combat. These later, Lightnings featured improved Allison V1710 engines producing 1,375 horsepower each. Electrically operated dive flaps that allowed pilots to control their speed in steep dives and avoid compressibility problems, powered ailerons that improved roll rate and control response, and increased ammunition capacity. These improvements made the Lightning even more formidable. The dive flaps were particularly important. Early P-38 models suffered from compressibility effects when diving at high speeds. As the aircraft approached the speed of sound, shockwaves would form on the wings and tail, causing the controls to become ineffective and the aircraft to pitch nose down uncontrollably. Several pilots were killed when they entered compressibility dives they couldn't recover from. The electrically operated dive flaps on the P-38J and L models allowed pilots to limit their diving speed, preventing compressibility while still maintaining enough speed to catch fleeing Japanese aircraft. The P-38's success in the Pacific came at a price beyond the aircraft lost to enemy action. The tropical environment was brutal on both aircraft and pilots. Temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit with crushing humidity. Pilots would return from missions soaked in sweat, exhausted from hours spent in the cramped cockpit. The heat inside the central nacelle, with the sun beating down and the engines radiating heat through the thin metal, was sometimes almost unbearable. The ground crews deserve special recognition for their extraordinary dedication. These mechanics, armourers and technicians worked in oppressive heat and humidity, often in the open air with minimal shelter, sometimes under Japanese air attack to keep the P-38s flying. They performed engine changes without hangars or proper equipment. They repaired battle damage with improvised materials. They loaded ammunition and fueled aircraft by hand. They worked through tropical rainstorms and blazing sun. Without these ground crews, the P-38 pilots could never have achieved their remarkable success. Malaria, dengue fever, and other tropical diseases took a constant toll. Many pilots and ground crew fell ill and had to be evacuated. The crude living conditions, tents in the jungle, limited fresh food, contaminated water, contributed to disease and exhaustion. Yet the men of the P-38 squadrons persevered, knowing that control of the air meant the difference between victory and defeat, between holding their hard-won positions and being pushed back into the sea. The P-38's long range made it invaluable for escort missions. As the Allied advance pushed north and west from Guadalcanal through the Solomons and into New Guinea, strategic targets came within range of American heavy bombers. But B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, despite their heavy defensive armament, were vulnerable to Japanese fighter attack without escort. Single-engine fighters like the P-40 and, later, the P-47 Thunderbolt lacked the range to escort bombers on long missions. The P-38, with its exceptional range extended by drop tanks, could accompany the bombers all the way to the target and back. On bomber escort missions, P-38 pilots faced a unique challenge. They needed to stay with the relatively slow bombers, cruising at speeds well below the Lightning's optimal performance, while remaining alert for Japanese interceptors that might attack from any direction. It required discipline and patience. When Japanese fighters did appear, P-38 pilots would jettison their drop tanks and engage, then return to escort the bombers after driving off the attackers. In one of the more unusual episodes of the Pacific War, aviation legend Charles Lindbergh spent time with P-38 squadrons in 1944. Lindbergh, who had made the first solo transatlantic flight in 1927, was 42 years old by this time, ancient by fighter pilot standards. Officially present as a civilian technical representative from United Aircraft Corporation, Lindbergh was there to teach P-38 pilots advanced techniques for extending their aircraft's range through proper cruise control and fuel management. But Lindbergh couldn't resist flying combat missions. The Army looked the other way while this civilian flew operational combat sorties. On July 28, 1944, while flying as wingman to Major Thomas McGuire on a fighter sweep over Seram Island in the Dutch East Indies, Lindbergh spotted a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft below. He dove on the enemy plane and engaged in a head-on attack. The Japanese pilot, either very brave or desperate, attempted to ram Lindbergh's P-38. Lindbergh held his course, firing his guns, and the Japanese aircraft, a Mitsubishi Ki-51 light bomber, disintegrated under the concentrated fire and crashed. The combat pilots of the 475th Fighter Group, who initially viewed this middle-aged civilian with skepticism, gained enormous respect for Lindbergh after witnessing his aggressive tactics and cool nerve. Lindbergh flew approximately 50 combat missions in the Pacific, though officially he was only conducting flight tests and training. He helped P-38 pilots extend their effective range by hundreds of miles through careful fuel management and efficient cruise settings, knowledge that saved lives and enabled longer-range missions. By the summer of 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of the Philippines, the P-38 Lightning had become the backbone of American fighter power in the Southwest Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur's forces had island-hopped from Guadalcanal through New Guinea, bypassing Japanese strongpoints and advancing toward the Philippines. Every step of this advance was protected by P-38s flying from captured airfields. In October 1944, MacArthur's forces landed at Leyte in the Philippines, fulfilling his famous promise, "I shall return." The P-38 played a crucial role in the Philippines campaign. The Lightning could operate from the primitive airfields and short runways common in the Philippines, unlike fighters such as the P-51 Mustang, which required longer, better-maintained runways. P-38 squadrons moved forward rapidly, establishing themselves at captured Japanese airfields and immediately beginning operations. The air battles over the Philippines in late 1944 were among the most intense of the Pacific War. Japan threw everything it had left into defending the Philippines, including the first organized kamikaze attacks. P-38 pilots found themselves facing not just conventional fighter and bomber attacks, but also suicide aircraft deliberately trying to crash into American ships and ground installations. The P-38's heavy firepower proved valuable against kamikaze aircraft. The concentrated fire from 4 machine guns and a cannon could often destroy a kamikaze before it reached its target, and the P-38's speed allowed it to intercept incoming suicide aircraft. P-38 pilots shot down numerous kamikazes during the Philippines campaign, though the sheer number of attacks meant many got through to hit American ships. By early 1945, Allied air superiority over the Philippines was complete. Japanese air power had been shattered. The surviving Japanese aircraft were forced to operate from bases on Formosa and in Indochina, too far away to effectively support Japanese ground forces in the Philippines. P-38s ranged freely over the islands, attacking Japanese troops, supply lines, and installations with near impunity. The final months of the war saw P-38 operations expand to Okinawa and eventually to the Japanese home islands themselves. By this time, however, the P-38's dominance was being challenged by a newer fighter, the North American P-51 Mustang. The Mustang, with its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and laminar flow wing, was faster than the P-38 at most altitudes and had comparable range. The P-51 was also cheaper to produce and easier to maintain, requiring half as many engines as the twin-engine Lightning. But in the unique environment of the Southwest Pacific, with its long overwater missions, primitive airfields, and the constant threat of engine failure far from land, pilots continued to prefer the P-38's twin-engine reliability. The knowledge that one engine could fail and you could still make it home was psychologically invaluable. Many P-38 pilots who transitioned to the P-51 later in the war admitted they never felt as confident over water in a single-engine fighter. The statistics of P-38 operations in the Pacific tell a remarkable story. By the end of the war, P-38 Lightning pilots had been credited with over 1,800 aerial victories in the Pacific theater. This represented more Japanese aircraft destroyed than any other American fighter type. The kill-to-loss ratio for the P-38 in the Pacific was approximately 2-1. For every P-38 lost to enemy action, 2 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. This may seem modest compared to modern standards, but it represented a dramatic reversal from the early war situation where Japanese fighters had dominated. More importantly, the 7 top-scoring American fighter aces in the Pacific all flew the P-38 Lightning. Richard Bong with 40 victories, Thomas McGuire with 38, Charles McDonald with 27, Gerald Johnson with 22, Jay Robbins with 22, Neil Kirby with 22, Thomas Lynch with 20. These men, and hundreds of other P-38 pilots, established American air superiority over the Pacific and made the Allied advance possible. The human cost of the air war was staggering. Thousands of young American pilots died in combat or accidents in the Pacific theater. Thousands more Japanese pilots were killed defending their increasingly untenable positions. The jungle islands where these battles were fought became graveyards for aircraft and men from both nations. Even today, decades after the war, the jungles of the Solomon Islands, New Guinea and the Philippines contain the wreckage of hundreds of aircraft, silent memorials to the men who flew them. The Solomon Islands campaign, which had begun with the marine landings on Guadalcanal in August 1942, officially ended in February 1943, when the last Japanese forces were evacuated from Guadalcanal. But fighting continued throughout the Solomons chain through 1943 and into 1944 as Allied forces pushed northwest toward Rabaul. The entire Solomon Islands campaign cost the United States approximately 7,100 men killed, 29 ships sunk, and 615 aircraft destroyed. Japanese losses were far heavier: 31,000 men killed or missing, 38 ships sunk, and 683 aircraft destroyed. These numbers tell only part of the story. Japan lost some of its most experienced naval infantry troops in the grinding jungle warfare on Guadalcanal. The Japanese Navy lost numerous veteran carrier pilots who could not be replaced. The loss of ships and aircraft stretched Japan's industrial capacity past the breaking point. The Solomon Islands campaign, along with the Battle of Midway 6 months earlier, marked the turning point of the Pacific War. Before Guadalcanal, Japan had advanced seemingly at will, conquering vast territories with minimal opposition. After Guadalcanal, Japan would never again mount a strategic offensive. From February 1943 onward, Japan fought a defensive war, giving ground slowly and at terrible cost, but ultimately unable to stop the Allied advance. The P-38 Lightning's role in this transformation cannot be overstated. When the Lightning arrived in the South Pacific in November 1942, American fighter pilots were struggling against superior Japanese aircraft and pilots. Within months, as American pilots learned to fight to the P-38's strengths, the tactical situation reversed. By mid-1943, Japanese pilots feared encounters with P-38s. The fork-tailed Devil had become the hunter, and Japanese aircraft the prey. The legacy of the P-38 Lightning extends beyond its combat record. The aircraft represented a triumph of American engineering and industrial capacity. Lockheed produced over 10,000 P-38s during the war, an extraordinary achievement for such a complex twin-engine aircraft. The Lightning served not just in the Pacific but also in the Mediterranean, in North Africa, and in Europe. It served as a fighter bomber, a night fighter, a reconnaissance aircraft, and even as a pathfinder for bomber formations. But it was in the Pacific, over the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, escorting bombers to Rabaul, sweeping over the Philippines, that the P-38 achieved its greatest success. The combination of exceptional range, heavy firepower, twin-engine reliability, and evolved tactics made it the ideal weapon for the vast distances and demanding conditions of the Pacific theatre. Today, fewer than a dozen P-38 Lightnings remain in flying condition, carefully maintained by warbird collectors and aviation museums. These survivors are treasured links to the past, tangible connections to the men who flew and fought in them over 7 decades ago. When a restored P-38 takes flight at an air show, its distinctive twin-engine sound echoing across the field, it serves as a flying memorial to an extraordinary aircraft and the extraordinary men who flew it. The pilots who flew the P-38 Lightning in the Pacific were, for the most part, young men in their early 20s. Many had never been far from home before the war. They came from farms in Wisconsin, from small towns across America, from cities and suburbs. The Army Air Forces trained them, put them in the cockpit of one of the most complex aircraft of the war, and sent them halfway around the world to fight an enemy who had years of combat experience and who flew aircraft specifically designed for the kind of war they would fight. That these young American pilots not only survived but prevailed, that they learned and adapted, that they developed tactics to exploit their aircraft's strengths and avoid its weaknesses, speaks to their courage, intelligence, and determination. That they achieved air superiority over the Pacific and made the Allied advance possible is a testament to their sacrifice. The story of the P-38 Lightning over the Solomon Islands is ultimately a human story. It's the story of Richard Bong, the quiet farm boy from Wisconsin who became America's greatest ace. It's the story of Thomas McGuire, the intense and driven pilot who died violating his own rules in an attempt to protect his wingman. It's the story of Charles McDonald, Gerald Johnson, and hundreds of other pilots whose names are less well known but whose courage was no less. It's the story of the ground crews who worked through heat and rain and exhaustion to keep the Lightnings flying. It's the story of commanders like General George Kenney, who understood how to use the P-38 effectively and who trusted his pilots to adapt and innovate. It's even the story of designers like Kelly Johnson and Hall Hibbard, whose revolutionary design gave American pilots the tools they needed to win. And it's the story of a remarkable aircraft that, for a crucial period in history, dominated the skies over the Pacific. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, the fork-tailed Devil, remains one of the most distinctive and successful fighter aircraft ever built. Its unique silhouette, its concentrated firepower, its exceptional range, and its twin-engine reliability made it perfectly suited for the vast distances and challenging conditions of the Pacific War. In the steaming jungles and azure waters of the Solomon Islands, American pilots in P-38 Lightnings learned to fight a new kind of air war. They mastered energy tactics, exploited their aircraft's speed and climb rate, concentrated devastating firepower on lightly built targets, and achieved air superiority that allowed Allied forces to advance island by island toward Japan itself. Japanese pilots, who had ruled the Pacific skies with confidence and skill in 1942, found themselves hunted by an aircraft they couldn't escape. They couldn't outclimb it. They couldn't outdive it. They couldn't outrun it. And if they tried to fight it in traditional dogfights, disciplined P-38 pilots simply refused to engage, using their speed advantage to dictate the terms of combat. The fork-tailed Devil became a symbol of American air power, a demonstration that superior engineering combined with tactical innovation and pilot skill could overcome any opponent. The twin-boomed fighter with its distinctive profile became an icon of American resolve and capability, a symbol that would inspire a generation and remain an enduring part of aviation history. For the young men who flew the P-38 Lightning over the Solomon Islands, who fought and died in the skies over Guadalcanal and Rabaul, over New Guinea and the Philippines, this aircraft was more than a weapon. It was their partner, their protection, and often their salvation. The Lightning brought them home when one engine failed. It gave them the range to reach distant targets and return. It provided the firepower to destroy enemy aircraft with devastating efficiency. And it gave them the performance to survive and prevail in one of history's most brutal air campaigns. The P-38 Lightning over the Solomon Islands, a revolutionary aircraft, a new way of fighting, and young American pilots who learned to master both. Together they changed the course of the Pacific War and wrote one of aviation history's most remarkable chapters. The fork-tailed Devil had arrived, and Japanese pilots discovered they couldn't escape.